We're going to begin today by discussing the seam allowance on this pattern. The seam allowance is 1/4 of an inch. To help familiarize yourself with what 1/4 of an inch seam allowance looks like, I grabbed a scrap of fabric. Mine is a woven, you're welcome to use a knit. And my seam gauge. If you don't have a seam gauge, you can use a standard ruler or tape measure. I like the seam gauge because it has the sliding notch here. I slid it to 1/4 of an inch, placed it against the free edge of the fabric, and marked with a pen. And then I take this scrap of fabric over to my sewing machine or my serger, and I run it through, ensuring that the stitches fall right atop the line that I've made here. This helps familiarize myself with exactly what 1/4 of an inch seam allowance looks like and where the 1/4 of an inch indicator marks are on my machine. For a serger, this may mean that your knife runs along the free edge of the fabric, not removing any of the fabric or only removing a small portion, and that your left needle stitches will fall right on this line where you've marked here. We are now ready to move on to construction and begin sewing our shirt together. You will have your bodice front and your bodice back pieces. I have both of these with the right side facing up. The wrong side is facing down. I am going to take the back bodice piece and flip it onto the front bodice piece so that right sides are facing one another. Flip it over. And you will want to line up the shoulder seams. Pin or clip the shoulder seams to hold them in place, and you will do that on both sides. We will now sew or serge with 1/4 inch seam allowance across both shoulder seams, adhering the two bodice pieces together. Shoulder seams on your bodice sewn. We will move on to attaching the sleeves. You will first open your bodice so that it is lying flat, right side up. You will have the neckline here, one arm side there, the other here. This is the front of the bodice and the back of the bodice. You will have two sleeves cut mirror imaged. One is your left sleeve and one is your right sleeve, and we will determine which is which now. You will place your sleeve right side down, so you will be looking at the wrong side of the fabric. Place it against the arm side. You will want to ensure that the notches match up. This is the wide notch that matches to the wide and the narrow notch that matches to the narrow. So this sleeve will go on this side of the garment. If this were my narrow notch, then I would lay this sleeve aside and I would use the other on this side of the garment. I'm going to take my sleeve right side down and slide it forward so that the center notch lines up with the shoulder seam on my arm side. Pin or clip. Now I have the narrow notch here, which I will line up with the narrow notch there. Pin or clip there as well. And again, the notch on the back, I have my wide notch. Line them up. So the indicator notches take all of the guesswork out of easing the curve of your sleeve into the shoulder seam. You can also, if you wish, pin the end points, which is where the arm side ends and your side seam begins. Line those up with the curve of your sleeve and pin those as well. So it's a little difficult to see because you do need to ease the curve in, but we will be sewing from one side around the curve to the other side, moving slowly and easing the sleeve in as you go, sewing with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Now the term easing it in as you go may be an unfamiliar term to you, and I want to show you quickly what that looks like. This is the bodice, the arm side, with my narrow notch at the front. This is my sleeve. You can see the narrow notch here, and they will line up with one another. Easing it in simply means moving in small increments and lining up the two curves. So you line up as much of the curve as you can here. So I have about 1 inch of my free edge of my fabric lined up. Sew that inch. And again, gently, without stretching the top fabric or the bottom, simply ease them in together, lining them up. Moving in very small increments, simply lining them up. We now have the sleeves sewn onto your garment. And if you're following the instructions in the pattern tutorial, it is at this point that you attach your neckband. I sew the side seams before attaching the neckband. If you wish to wait and do the side seams after our neckband tutorial tomorrow, that's fine and you are welcome to wait. I'm going to go ahead and sew the side seams. I have my garment here, right side up. The front of the bodice is here and the back is here. I'm going to take the back of the bodice, fold it over atop the front. Lining up the arm, matching up the notches on the sleeve, pinning there, lining up the side seam, pinning or clipping periodically as you go. This is your waistline notch. Line that up as well, all the way down to the hemline. And we will be sewing from the sleeve point along the inside of the sleeve and down the side seam to the hemline. We will do that on both sides.